Welcome to the Magician and the Fool podcast. This is episode number 41. My name is Dominic. I am one of the co-hosts. The other host is Janice. You'll hear from him shortly. In today's episode, we have the pleasure of speaking to the very multi-talented Susan Chang to talk about tarot, divination, and one of her new books, 36 Secrets. You can find more about Susie Chang on her website, tsusanchang.com. She has a blog there. You can also find a tarot class that she runs. She also has an interesting shop where she sells perfumes and tarot cases and other items. Susie has a podcast, the Fortune's Wheelhouse podcast, which I think many of our listeners will find very interesting. So if you haven't listened to that, give it a try. You can find it wherever podcasts are found. Her books are Tarot Deciphered, 36 Secrets, and Tarot Correspondences. Susie is not a one-trick pony, though. She is a musician, a lover of languages, and I don't know if she considers herself one, but I would say a sorceress, perhaps. And if you know Susie, she's always fun to listen to, very charismatic, a lot of energy, and so we really enjoyed this one. We want to say thank you to our Patreon supporters, as always, for helping cover the expenses of the show. It's a thing. Podcasts cost a little bit of money, so we appreciate it very much. If you would like to help support us, please head over to Patreon and just type in the Magician and the Fool podcast and you'll find us there. The great thing about our supporters is they support us without any coaxing. We don't have time to really put together all sorts of crazy content. I know a lot of people have some really cool benefits and rewards on their Patreon. We don't, and our Patreon supporters are still very generous in helping us out. So for the month of May, in honor of Mercurialia, which is the Festival of Mercury, which is held on May 15th, traditionally, we are going to offer anyone who is a patron in the month of May a complimentary 3-card tarot reading from Janice. Janice is a long-time tarot reader, decades, and fun fact, I don't know if any of you remember Miss Cleo from the 90s, but he may or may not have worked for her at one point. I don't know if that helps or hurts his case, but he's a pro, and like I said, anyone in the month of May who is a patron will get a 3-card reading, regardless of the level of your support. So we will check in early June to see who was on board in May, and we will reach out to you for that reading. And hopefully in the future we'll do a little bit more, but like I said, we are busy with families and jobs, and the podcast kind of stretches us to our limit as far as time, but we do want to show our appreciation and honor Hermes Mercury. Having said that, we dedicate this episode to Hermes and Asclepius. And may the merits we accumulate doing this work be distributed to all sentient beings, so that they, together with us, will equally realize awakening.
This is the Orphic hymn to Hermes. Cluthimu Hermea, Dios angela Maya dosue, Pancrates etorechon en agonia koiran ethneton, Elfron, poikilobule, diactere arge fonta, Deno pedile filandre, logutne toisi profeta, Gymnatsin hos chaires, doliais tapatais trophiuche, Hermenel panton ker dempore lisi merimne, hos cheireseneches erenes hoplon a Memphis. ko rukiota makar eriunia poikino muthe, ergasiais eparoge, philethne toisen anankais, glosses denon hoplontos basmion anthropoisi. Cluthimu euchomenu biotu telos eslon opadzon, ergasiesi, logucharisin, kaimnemo synesin.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. That's
You're
awesome.
welcome. Love that hymn. It was the first one I ever learned, of course, but it's a particularly nice one.
Welcome to the show, everyone. We are very excited and happy to have
See Susan Chang.
Welcome to the show. We are extremely happy and excited to have Susie Chang with us today to talk about tarot, divination, and her new book. Welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, yeah. We're really excited and glad you agreed. I think you're a wealth of knowledge, a great resource, and just excited to kind of pick your brain. So...
Yeah, I've listened to your show for a really long time. And I was just saying before we went on air that, you guys get tremendous guests and you ask really great questions. And it's an honor to be here.
Well, you are added to the list of tremendous guests. So, I'm assuming most of our audience knows who you are, but you never know. So if you don't mind, would you kind of briefly give a rundown of who you are, how you got into the esoteric practices, tarot specifically, and we'll go from there.
Yes. Yeah. I always have a bit of trouble figuring out who I am. I think that's why we're all in this business.
Right.
But I actually made a map yesterday because I cannot keep track of all the things I do. Usually I try to keep it down to 6 or 8, but right now it's kind of blowing up. Most of what I do centers around tarot. I would say about 80%, 90% of what I do centers around tarot in one form or another. Some people know me from the Fortune's Wheelhouse podcast, which is the esoteric tarot podcast I host with Mel Moline. I write books on tarot. There's Tarot Correspondences, which was my first sort of 777 for Tarot book in 2018. And then there's 36 Secrets, my book on the minors, and then Tarot Deciphered, which is essentially the podcast between hardcovers. And then, let's see, I teach tarot. I have an online tarot course called The Living Tarot. I do readings. I make tarot cases. I have sort of a Etsy shop where I do that. I make astrologically based perfumes. I teach at Smith College doing a writing course for undergraduates. Let's see, I'm just rotating my map here. And I usually have, I try to write books in the fall, but I usually have some kind of like workshops or teaching or other things going on. So currently what's on the docket is going to be collaborating or helping out Jack Grail in his upcoming Homeric course, which is basically a reading of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I'm going to be doing my sort of like linguistic commentary on the Greek with him for that in my intellectually irresponsible way. So that will be going on for the next year or so. So that's, another side project.
That's a super cool side project.
Yeah.
So you have a music background, right?
Yeah, that's one of my backgrounds. Yeah, I started out as a pianist, I guess, actually as violinist, and then I shifted to piano. And I studied piano and went to Juilliard pre-college from ages 10 to 18 or so. But, that was just the very, very, very first beginning of things for me. And like a lot of people, that's a real winnowing process going there. So those who don't become recording artists kind of tend to have midlife crisis, about magic at the age of 20 and midlife crisis about music at the age of 20 and give it up. So I kind of followed that pattern, but then kind of got back into it with various other instruments, played the saxophone for a while, just sort of post-traumatic recovery music.
How do you feel like that that strong musical background influenced your thinking and the way you approach divination and magic?
Well, it's interesting because I haven't really actually thought about that, but it's a really interesting question because there's something about music that is actually quite like divination and magic in that there's an extremely technical side, and then there's a side that's extremely not, right? So for example, one of the things that I would do in school when I was learning sort of the technical side of music, of course, there were scales and, just hours and hours of practice every day, but also just learning a lot about the structure of music, and learning to do 7/4 polyrhythms and read 5 clefs at once and, do really hard stuff with music. But then at the moment of performance, of course, you leave it all behind. It's, you leave it all behind and it's just sort of in there in the background informing what you do. So that's the analogy I actually use all the time with people when it comes to these esoteric correspondences that I seem to have become associated with. They're there, the tables are there, you study them, you learn from them, but then when you go into the oracular moment itself, you kind of let it subside and you let what's most important rise to the fore. Great.
Yeah, for me, I have a pretty strong martial arts background going back many years, and so it sounds very familiar. You have to just keep building on that foundation. Oftentimes, people want to skip ahead really quickly. My daughter started piano and she wants to just start playing songs right from the beginning, and it's like, no, you have to. There's a pretty rigorous foundational process you have to kind of set up first before you get to the fun stuff.
Yes. And then there's always the danger that because, we're all, or so many of us have a sort of an addiction to being good students, you can kind of get lost in the technicalities and forget to let go when it's time to let go. So there's that as well.
Do you guys find, Janice, I want you to jump in too, because you're a lifelong tarot reader. Do you feel like with the, and he's gone.
Uh-oh.
I guess.
He's like, no, I'm not going to jump in.
I guess that's the answer. Well, we'll start with you, and then when he pops back on, we'll ask him. But do you feel like people jump headfirst into the tarot without setting up a strong foundation first?
Well, yes, but I actually don't think that's a problem.
Okay.
I was sort of like, when we were doing pre-show chat, we were talking about questions and things we could talk about, and I brought up the idea of rigor versus ease, and and when I wrote that down, I was like, oh no, everyone will find out that I'm not rigorous.
Well,
because I'm really not. There's a part of me that feels like there is no such thing as a novice tarot reader. I say that a lot because I believe that there's something to be said for just the willingness to engage in the process, regardless of how hard you've studied or what you know. There's something to be said about just being open to what tempting fate, literally, often with the cards. And I think that something happens in the dynamic between the client and the reader, in the need for the client for advice and the willingness of the reader to help. It's almost like a polarization, a magnetic current in which something arises. So, I tend to be of the view that it's possible to read without any preparation whatsoever, but that's just what gets you started. And then over time, you build on that. You build your tarot worldview until it encompasses everything you know. And then, you keep trying to learn and grow until you have, well, there is no endpoint, right? It just keeps going. So in general, I tend to feel with magical practice, and this is why I say everyone will find out I'm not rigorous, that I think that I encounter more people who are daunted by by their own unmagicality, than people who are posing. People who are more afraid to even begin. And maybe that's just the demographic I work with. So, my whole sort of way of talking to people is to try and just talk them off the ledge and, get people to feel like they have the confidence and the ability to start on this path, no matter how unprepared, uninitiated, and illegitimate they may be. So, that's my view. And yet at the same time, doesn't keep me from practicing my scales all the time.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I was going to push back a little. You said that you're not rigorous, but I think your consistency counts for rigor. You seem to be really immersed in this world and have been for a while. And I would suspect that you don't skip a beat. Like every day you're looking at things and doing some stuff.
Well, I think that what I do think is essential is that whatever you do and wherever you're coming from, no matter how unprepared or uninitiated or illegitimate you are, I do think you have to give it your best, whatever that means for you. And everyone comes with a different box of skills and aptitudes and abilities. And I think there's something to be said for doing it with your whole heart.
Yeah.
So that I would certainly agree.
Cool. And Janice, are you back?
So I want to speak for a minute to what you just said about the dynamic between a reader and a client, because that's something I find very interesting. So could you, before I respond to it, could you recapitulate that?
Oh, yeah. So what I was saying that I believe that when it comes to readings, there's a dynamic that arises between the client and the reader, where something about the need of the client for help and the willingness of the reader to help combine and create almost a current or an electric current or a polarity in which the answers arise. It's not either's responsibility alone, but, and I believe that that's possible regardless of how much, training or study you have as a diviner. I think a lot of it is actually getting out of the way.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I'm actually of the school that the cards are always right. It's just
me too. Yeah,
diviner's interpretive ability, which is a hermetic characteristic, because one of the titles attributed to Hermes by Plato is Hermeneutes. I probably butchered that, or hermeneutes. You know what I mean? That which is what we get hermeneutics from.
Yes, and in the Orphic hymn we have Hermeneu Panton, which is her, interpreter of all. Mm-hmm.
Right, exactly. And so for me, divination is less an act of quote unquote connecting with the other, although the connection is important, and all these other things that people try to make divination about. It is more an act of interpretation, of being able to accurately interpret the signs before you. But I think that extends even to all divination. I mean, really, the entire world is one big book filled with living signs. And if you can learn to become a good interpreter, you can read the signs everywhere you go and everything you see.
I 100% agree with that. And it's interesting, on the Kabbalistic tree of life, there's a way of representing that, I don't know how much Kabbalah you guys get into, but on the sort of seventh and eighth spheres of the 10-sphere tree of life, that's Netzach and Hod. They are known as the spheres of prophecy. And but they're different kinds of prophecy. So Netzach, which is in Hermetic Kabbalah ascribed to Venus, is kind of that sort of ecstatic download that people get from time to time. Whereas Hod, which is in Hermetic Kabbalah ascribed to Hermes, to Mercury, is indirect download. It is interpreting. It is divination. It is working by signs. And there's something about that that sphere that is humble in a way. You kind of put your head down and you don't assume that you have the answers. You just use what you've got to try and make sense of what's appearing in the world around you.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with that. And there's a northern parallel to that, because in the northern mysteries you have runic divination, and then on the other hand you have Scyther or Spey, which is presided over by Freya, who's the northern manifestation of the Venus principle. And so they're really, just as, Odin is the mercurial principle within the northern mysteries, and he presides over Galdur, which is, the runic divination. So, you made a really good point there, because there are those two forms of divination, and I think those two forms are complementary too. I think that they work best in synthesis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about the idea of sacrifice in the context of divination lately. Well, thinking is probably too strong a word. I've been sort of, musing and bullshitting on the idea of sacrifice in the context of ritual and readings. One thing that I've been playing with this idea is that what we do in divination is we look for meaning, right? That's one of the things we do. It's one of the ways we combat the modern day affliction of meaninglessness. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think is that I like to imagine that every reading is a form of sacrifice, and that what we sacrifice on the altar of the oracle is doubt. The idea that meaning and doubt exists in this kind of inverse ratio. And that's why when we do a reading, we can never ask the same question twice, right? Because if you take back your sacrifice, you take back your doubts, then you have to give back the meaning. And that's something that has kind of shaped a lot of the way I kind of conduct my own praxis these days.
I love what you said here about the sacrifice. And it's interesting to me too, because it illuminates how we all have, genuine readers, and I think that there are not that many, but genuine readers, we all have these certain things that I think they're developmental milestones of understanding that you reach, mm-hmm. Where it's just very clear, like the fact that everything is speaking, and you just have to learn to listen, which is like,
and to ask good questions too.
And to ask good questions. The art of asking the question is so huge. It's
huge. I mean, I often find when I'm reading for people, and I read for people every week, half a dozen to a dozen people a week. And I often find that people are asking questions they don't actually want to know the answer to. Because if there's only one right answer, it's probably the wrong question.
Well, and then there's always the phenomenon of the Cassandra complex, but that's an entire, book-long conversation in itself. But what I was going to say is the point of it being a sacrifice is very big to me, and this is why. If you look at divination, so this is one of my pet gripes, you could say.
Here we go.
So if you look at divination around the world historically, even to the present day, it is usually conducted within the auspices of a religious tradition or temple. But in the Western world, with the sort of deliberate fissure that was forced between the esoteric and the exoteric traditions, and there's repair work being done in our age on that, and has been for at least 100 years, maybe 200 max. But still, I mean, the exoteric and the esoteric branches of spiritual tradition were separated in the West. And because of that, and also because of a sort of, Abrahamic, I even hate saying Abrahamic because I love Abraham, but, but the Abrahamic influence, which disparages divination, mm-hmm. It turned it into this sort of bastard art, being seen as a bastard art in the West when it is not. Divination traditionally, like if you look at Ifa, for instance, mm-hmm. you know what I mean? It is always in the context of a spiritual or religious tradition, period. It is a spiritual practice. It is an extension of the gods. And it should be treated with reverence. Every single divination I do is offered up beforehand as a sacrifice to Hermes. Mm-hmm. And that's from my whole life. That is till the day I die. Every divination, even if it's just a me divination, even if I'm just taking out the Petit Lenormand and laying out a few cards, I don't skip that part, okay? Because it's sacred.
Yes, I think that reverence is is a critical ingredient in the sense that we cannot do this work if we are not connected to the world around us, right? If we're not connected to the anima mundi, if we don't recognize that we are part and parcel of the whole cosmos, then if we are separate, which so much of our upbringing encourages us to think of ourselves as separate, we can't do this work.
Right. And the gift of prophecy is given by the gods themselves.
Right.
And when you make that sacrifice, see, this goes back, it's weird how runes are creeping in here, but this goes back to the rune of Gebo or Gifu, which means gift, but a gift is a sacrifice. The rune is the shape of a cross, just like you could say the Christian cross even. The idea of sacrifice is an exchange. It's a dialectical exchange between one thing and another. Think of Christmas, we exchange gifts,
Yes.
And so we offer up to the gods, and in their mercy, they send down upon us their gifts. And I believe that those of us who have some kind of oracular inclination or some kind of prophetic gift, that comes from and is the manifestation of a divine principle within our soul. And so by enacting the sacrifice, we actually give reverence to the divine principle within our soul, which is rooted vertically in a deity.
Yes, and so great is the gift of the runes or the interpretive object, whatever it may be. So concentrated is that power that even a god has to sacrifice for it. If you think about the myth of Odin, he had to sacrifice himself to himself just to receive the runes, is the way it's put.
It's so true. It's so true. And even Hermes is, called the companion of the feast. The bull slaughterer. We could think of the sacrifice of Prometheus, where he taught mankind how to perform the art of sacrifices, and also, of course, tricked the gods and made it so that humankind would be able to keep the meat, which would in turn nourish them. So he enacted this twofold. He performed this twofold act, and I think that what's implicit in these myths is the idea of that sacrifice is a gift given to us by the gods, and B, it's meant to benefit both God and human being. And C, when we treat divination as a prophetic sacrifice, then we take ourselves out of the equation and we enable ourselves to act as an instrument for something greater than us that can move through us and not only speak through us, but can actually it's almost like saying, so I did my taxes recently, and there was this whole drama, and they had me download this program, download it onto my computer, and then turn it on, and they could actually see my desktop.
Oh yes.
And I was like, they can do that at my work, but I was kind of creeped out that they could do that but anyway, the whole point is they were able to, when I downloaded this program, go into my desktop and be able to click around on the site and click around on my tax forms. That's kind of like, you do this with the God. And the other aspect of it is they can enter into your mind and direct your perception to the things in the reading that show that they can direct the God can direct your perception to the information in the reading that in turn the client needs to receive.
Yes. And I think that has, that sort of emphasizes or underscores the fact that you can't hold on too tight, because you have to leave room for the God to breathe and get your ego out of it. I think that's absolutely right. And there's also, besides sacrifice, and sometimes you could even say that you're sacrificing your own ego at the same time. Besides sacrifice, another sort of hermetic side of divination is the idea that you take it lightly as almost like a game. He is the god of games and trickery as well. It's even in that story you're telling about the origin of sacrifice. In the Orphic hymn, he's called. Let's see, it's like gymnasin hoschaires doliais tapatais strophiuche. So you delight in deceit and trickery. And to me, that is part of that headspace that we enter into with a reading where it matters a great deal and it matters not at all. at the same time. It's a games mentality to some extent. And this is something I picked up from Marie-Louise von Franz, who is a Jungian I've been reading a lot lately for this project I did. And the idea that and if you read Jung's introduction to the I Ching, he says something about how you enter into it in all earnestness, but then whatever happens, happens. You accept the consequences, right? And I think that's quite difficult to do very often, because it's a balance you have to maintain, because the person who's coming to you, I always say nobody comes to tarot readers just because everything's going great. They're invested and they have some very important thing they want to talk to you about. But that's why they're coming to you, because you're the one who can stand there in the center of this balance and engage in it in all earnestness, but also let go of the consequence, whatever it is. There's it's sort of like at the end of a chaos magic ritual, right? You would say, does not matter, need not be. Same idea.
Well, yeah, it's the magician and the fool. It's because, the magician and the fool are really two sides of one mystery, a two-faced mystery. And I think that what you said about the game aspect is totally huge, because most divination systems, not all, but most do originate, at least in the West, I should say. But even in other areas, they do originate in games. And there's nothing wrong with that. It actually is a mystical reality. There's a deeper truth that's hidden there in the idea of the juggler.
Absolutely. 100%. I mean, I think, if you look at any sort of oracular system, there's a game equivalent of it. We have playing cards, and we have tarot. We have checkers, we have geomancy, we have, dice used in both contexts. We have bones used in both contexts. So, it's just two sides of the same literal coin.
I mean, pickup sticks. That's
yes, yes, for your Yarrow stocks. Yes.
Yeah. So it just goes on, and I think that having that playful attitude when engaging it is super important too. And also, it goes back to, I love that you brought up the Jungian aspect. I love Marie-Louise von Franz. She is. I don't feel she gets the due she deserves.
Yeah, her divination and synchronicity essay just blew the top off my head.
It's so good, and her mind. I mean, she's tremendous. She was tremendous. But the idea of going back to the child state of mind, Dom used to really be into this Zen monk. Was it Basho, I think? But he always talked about entering into the child, like a childlike state or a child's mind. Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas that you have to become like children, and trample their clothes and become like children. And I think becoming like that child, like that divine child, like Phanes or, Heru, there's something there.
There absolutely is. And I think there's something else in there that I'd like to kind of tease out, which is the role of randomness, of stochastics and sortilege. The idea, stochastics just meaning, randomness, but it comes from the root stochon, which is, it has to do with arrangements of things and marching and walking and guessing. So yeah, and I think that there's something that Marie-Louise von Franz said about the necessity of chaos in divination, right? So when we're talking about oracular methods that use as their basis the idea that you cannot know what the outcome is going to be because it's random, that makes me think a little bit of a couple of different things. It makes me think of, for example, the idea, the mythological idea of necessity and time, Ananke and Kronos being the parents of chaos, of chaos. So the idea that, which always sounds to me like a restatement of Newton's second law of thermodynamics, about entropy, necessity and time producing chaos. But regardless of that, what I would think is that, chaos is like the Tao. It's the nothingness upon which something or everything depends. So if you can imagine, looking at the night sky and you see a field of stars, when we impose the constellations upon that field of stars, we are creating meaning. But we are not actually the creators. The meaning co-arises between us and that field of chaos. And I think that that's essential. I think that what divination provides for us is, here's a Patrick Dunn quote, it provides whatever it is we're looking at, the substrate, a superabundance of information which cannot be decoded back into meaningfulness by the conscious mind. So, that chaos is a way of shutting down that conscious mind and allowing it to get out of the way so we can return to that sort of tabula rasa, full childlike mentality. And there's a parallel to this in language as well. This is another idea of Patrick Dunn's, which I picked up like a magpie. But the idea that, metaphor is also a way that we get at the same kind of state of mind linguistically. There's an idea that, there's metaphors that are obvious, and then there are metaphors that are not. Like, if I say love is a battlefield, that's a really cliched metaphor. If I say the heart is a lonely hunter, that's a, slightly less cliched metaphor. But there's a whole category of metaphors known as paralogical metaphors. So the example Patrick gives is the book is the buffalo of the library. What even does that mean? Or if I say the moon is a river of howling pearls, what even does that mean? So there's something about the ability to take language and produce a field of chaos out of it that is magical, that resets the semiotic web so that we can do ritual and magic and produce something new. There's a passage I'm not going to look up right now about the bard Taliesin, where he transforms himself into a Sem, and he transforms himself into all these various creatures. And to me, that is, I get chills down my spine when I read that, because that's just like a paragraph of paralogical metaphor resetting the stage so that reality can be reformed.
Oh yeah, I'm a stag of 7 tines and so on. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Well, you know who Rimbaud was a wunderkind for that.
Right.
Oh my God. It's crazy. I started reading Rimbaud at maybe 16 years old, and I still can't get enough of him.
Yeah, same.
He was such a magician with his words. But I want to go back to your point about chaos for a minute. Mm-hmm. There's an Egyptian theological concept. It's a fundamental Egyptian theological concept of the Zep Tepi, the first thing. And, the Zep Tepi is the Egyptian Genesis. Everything arises out of the noon, which is a preformative chaos. And I think it might be helpful for people to step out of the sort of postmodern Western idea of chaos as disorder and go get to the more archaic idea of chaos as a pregnant potentiality, like the Mula Prakriti of Indian metaphysics, of Sankhya metaphysics. The idea that there is this endless potentiality, which is in the Egyptian tradition described as a cosmic ocean, black cosmic ocean, and from this, the first day, the beginning of all creation occurs. And every time we enter into the divinatory or magical process, it is the Zep Tepi. It is the first day. We are conjuring the universe anew out of chaos.
Yes, precisely. I think that's perfect. There's a model of reality that von Franz uses, where there's sort of 2 intersecting wheels. There's the wheel of eternal and acausal order, and then there's the wheel that we live on of linear time. And where they intersect, that's the oracular moment, the breathing hole, the spiraculum aeternitatis, and that's where we have a chance to access that chaos.
And it's funny because in the chaos we're talking about, there is this implicit order, which we could start going into quantum physics and Bohm and all this with implicit order, and all of that. But it also makes me think of, again, the same idea in parallel traditions of the Egyptian Ma'at and the Indian Arta, which is Ritta, which is that same that harmonious. You could translate it order, justice, cyclical time, harmonious patterns, the harmonious pattern of everything, but that includes chaos. That includes because it's like, if you look at a fractal, or if you look at chaos mathematics and quantum physics, when what appears to us as chaos, if we're able to zoom out enough, we begin to see the implicit order that it is a part of.
That's right. It's thoroughly enmeshed. And the thing is that when I think from sort of a normal, mundane, materialistic worldview, we think of things as very linear, as being, I kind of use the example of a marble run going from, point A to point B. This lever causes this chute to drop, this spring causes this action to happen, this bounce, etc. But the acausal view looks at the world as, if you can imagine, like an entire field of intersecting gears. Every one thing that moves everything else. You cannot say which is the cause, because everything co-arises, and therefore it does not matter where you shine your light in that whole arrangement. You will find something true.
As a diviner, as a seer, with so much experience and so much practice, walking through life, do you just see meaning everywhere? Because there are symbols everywhere. How do you approach that, your mundane life? Because as you've been very beautifully explaining, both of you, this kind of interpenetration that we're able to experience when we divine and kind of look deeper into the workings of the anima mundi. Mm-hmm. How does this affect your daily life?
That's a really fantastic question. I mean, I think, I like to set my day in a way. I do this with ritual. I do this with drawing a couple of cards and then kind of working with the cards and doing a 2-line spell that sort of informs my entire day. But a lot of it is kind of just there in the background. Like, for example, okay, I'll give you another musical example. I have what's known as absolute pitch. So I generally know, or at least it seems to be getting a bit warped with age, which is disturbing, but I don't know why. But I generally know what note I'm hearing. And people used to ask me, who were not musicians, does that distract you all the time? Are you always thinking about what note that is? And no, it's there if you need it. It's there. It's just knowing, but it's there if you want to know. And that's how I feel about meaning, in a sense. It's sort of there if you are paying attention, and not there if you're not. So I think that it's possible to get, there is, in addition to the affliction of meaninglessness, there is an affliction of over meaningfulness, where people can get a little bit paranoid and conspiratorial. And I think it's good to maintain the sacred nature of what we do by keeping it separate, right? So there's times when you're on and times when you're off, but you can have faith that it's always available to you when you need it.
Well, and I had a friend when I was 16 when I met. And my friend Joel, we used to, it was during, my whole life has been a magical period, but it was during an earlier magical period in my life when a lot of synchronicities and things were happening. But I remember him saying some really choice things to me at the time. And one of the things he said was, once you get into magic, once you start practicing magic, once you go on the path of magical practice, magical life, he's like, there's no turning back. He's like, he's like, what? He's like, you can even try to, you can, whatever you want to do. He was like, it's just not going to happen. Once you're on the path, it starts to move on its own. And you just have to accept that you're on it forever. And it's just going to keep working. And I found that to be true. I found several things he said at the time to be true. Another thing, which I don't want to go into, but he also brought up a point, which I think is debatable, but a very interesting conversation in itself, was that he said, when you're a magician, it's very difficult to be involved with someone who isn't a magician, and it's never going to work out. Now, I don't know that I agree with that, but I think a whole conversation could be had over, like, if you're a magician or a practitioner of magic in any form, what the implications of being with another magician are, because that can be a whole can of worms. Or being with somebody who's totally not magical at all, not interested, but supportive or whatever. or not supportive, that's an interesting conversation that should be shelved for another time, I think. But to get back to what he said originally, so it's like that with divination too, I think, where once you're divining, you can maybe turn the volume down, but you can never turn it off completely. But the difference between a diviner and schizophrenic, I think, is the ability to modulate, to have that meaningful semiotic skill where you are able to, when necessary, turn it up, look around, see what you see. And also sometimes a symbol will literally, like, you may be totally in a mundane, okay, I have to go like pick up the kids, I have to pay this bill, or whatever, I need to go to the doctor. And then all of a sudden a symbol like flings itself at you right at your feet, like you can't ignore it. You were trying to get normal stuff done, and now you have to go into magic mode.
Yes, absolutely. And for me, it's a physical feeling. I don't know if it is for everybody else, but it's sort of like there's an on switch and an off switch, And the thing is that, like, you have to, I think there's something to be said for just really knowing what that feels like for you. I mean, for anybody who's doing this work, and not being overly precious about it. I mean, I remember when I was first, learning the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, I'd be sweating away trying to remember my archangel names and which direction they were in. And then, some kid wanders in saying, I missed the bus. It's like, well, what are you going to do? And I know you guys can relate to this as parents. Having a magical life alongside your mundane life creates, I think in the best case creates an ability to code switch right between the two of them.
Well, yeah, because you're doing an invocation, then all of a sudden, Dad.
I know. And I'm so glad you guys understand this, because, there are lots of magicians who don't have kids. And I often think, well, that's great, but could you do this with a 4-year-old?
Well, on one hand, it could be a good thing. Like you guys were talking about controlling the volume, the noise ratio. If I didn't have kids constantly pulling me in different directions, I might kind of be a little bit more unbalanced between my mundane and more spiritual, magical kind of worldview and practices. It kind of keeps me grounded a little bit too much sometimes, but I think that balance is actually a good thing.
Well, we've all met those people who are super into magic but can't even fucking hold down an apartment. You know what I mean?
Well, sure. Yeah. And it also forces you to have the courage of your convictions, because you can bet that nobody around you is going to be, on board with what you're doing in exactly the way you're doing it.
Right.
So,
Well, when my 20-year-old was a baby, for obvious reasons that, I had to be with him a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really deep in my meditation practice at that time. But there were times where I was different places where the external environment was not supportive of meditation. Like you'd hear like some dump truck or some fucking thing like that, some person screaming, whatever. But I taught myself to make those things part of the meditation.
Yes.
You have to.
Yes.
So instead of letting the guy with the weed whacker at like 6:30 in the morning right outside of your window bother you, you invert that and make that something that brings you deeper into the trance, deeper into the meditation, deeper into the magical rite. So for me, I don't believe in interruptions anymore. I believe in opportunities for practice. I believe that these things are actually opportunities to go deeper into what we're doing, and we can use them as instruments to draw us more into that moment.
Yeah.
That's a great attitude.
Yeah.
It really is. Yeah. What is that saying about meditation that, I'm sure you can tell me the source, because it's been driving me crazy. I can't remember what it is, but under normal circumstances, 1 hour is plenty. When things are really busy and you're super distracted, no less than 3 will do.
Well, this conversation is leading me to a question. So, being that you could read the world around you, that the world is just one big mirror, are all decks equal? I mean, is the My Little Pony deck equally as valid as the Rider-Waite deck?
Well, here's the thing, I kind of, yes, but I think that one thing that readers sometimes get hung up on is the idea that you cannot do something with this deck that you can do with that deck. And I get a little bit antsy about that because I don't see how you separate the diviner from their instruments, right? You never can take out everything you know about the Seven of Pentacles just because you're looking at a Seven of Pentacles that you don't normally look at. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think there's something to be said for not being overly prescriptive when it comes to doing that. Now, there's also several different layers to a reading, right? And this is something that I like to talk about as kind of analogy you can use as lectio divina or pardes, peshat remes derish sod, that you have the sort of literal level, and then you have the sort of illusion level or the figurative level. You have the sort of homiletic level, and you have the sort of secret level. And, and I think that at some point, it's always possible. I mean, you should never forget the literal level. We tend to go deep and high with readings, but never forget that whatever you're looking at is going to have some kind of image, that matters. It matters that this particular Seven of Pentacles has a guy with a rake, but this one doesn't. This one has like a squirrel, or like a bunch of nuts on it. It's like it matters because there was a reason you chose that deck. There was a reason the client was attracted to it. What the client sees in it is also important. So I try never to get too far away, no matter what else I'm doing in the reading, from that layer of being just very simple and literal and seeing what's on the card. So to that extent, yeah, you could use My Little Pony because what you see or what the client sees in that might be relevant. You cannot ever rule it out.
Well, being that I first saw the My Little Pony deck, because Janice uses that quite exclusively. Janice, what do you think about this?
I definitely see Susie's point, and I understand, that her point kind of dovetails with our sort of meta conversation we've been having here about the point that divination is implicit in the fabric of reality. And so technically you could use your kitchen knives for divination if you understand how to cast bones or other random objects. You know what I mean? So
yes, sticks and stones.
Right. So there's a difference. I think there's a qualitative difference though between being able to use anything as a interpretive instrument and calling anything tarot. And I think right now we are inundated with really a myriads of plethora of what, in my opinion, are essentially from the perspective of the tradition of the tarot. Illegitimate decks that do not draw upon or build upon tarot tradition. I mean, it is a tradition. It does have a sort of genetic descent into different branches, and we see these decks created by people who may be talented artists, but we also see decks being created by people who just want to make a little bit of scratch. And as somebody who's devoted literally the majority of their life to this, I definitely have some trouble with those decks. At the same time, though, I think of this period kind of like the late 60s, early 70s. There was an explosion of interest in the occult, witchcraft, magic during that time, and there was a lot of pop manifestations of these things. And I mean, let's face it, most people are going to remain superficial in their interest, and the cream rises to the top. So you're going to have superficial decks, and superficial people are going to use those decks. And as far as the deeper material, well, only the people who are comfortable, swimming in deeper waters are going to be interested in and able to access those things. One thing I've found is that when it comes to secrets, they're often hidden in plain sight, right in front of your face.
Yes. Well, here's where I can meet you halfway on that. I mean, I think that one thing I'm constantly on my hobby horse about when it comes to tarot is that literally everything in the world is in there. Every damn thing, from tying your shoes to falling in love. And if you're trying to read a deck with a very limited set of meanings. So you say, the Three of Swords can mean this and only this. You're always going to be limited. So I try to teach people to practice seeing the world in tarot language and translating it back so that every literal last thing that they experience goes back into the deck. And what happens sometimes with what you might call, lighthearted decks or fun decks or, theme decks or novelty decks is that can limit your perspective. If it causes you to see the world as just a subset of what it really is, that's not helpful, right? So to me, if you as the reader can bring everything you've got, your whole world, your whole worldview, your whole, cosmological background to every reading and every deck, that's one thing. But if you look at the deck and suddenly you feel like you're dealing with 1/10 of your normal mind, then that's definitely a problem. This is a little bit of a tangent, but just to bring it back to prediction and what we believe about cards versus what reality you run up against when you're using them. I have this practice where I spreadsheet and track everything, which the astrologers would say has to do with the overabundance of Virgo in my chart. But the thing is that what I do that to stay truthful, right? So that whatever I draw, I need to see how it turned out, because I don't want it all to be theory for me, right? Mm-hmm. I want to know how this stuff has traction in real life so that I can bring that back to the people I read for and tell them, look, you got the Three of Swords. Here's 5 ways it might shake out, and part of the oracular process is having an instinct for which one is the right one. But one of the things I discovered over the course of doing 36 Secrets is that, every chapter in here has a section where I talk about how it showed up for me. One of the things I found is that the cards will teach you what they mean. They will tell you if you are not sure. And that's why I tell everybody to have a card of the day practice, because you get freebies. They tell you how they're going to show up and what they might mean in ways that you do not expect. For example, that Three of Swords I was just talking about, most people read that as, heartbreak or sorrow or trouble. But it was once a card of contracts and marriage. And, over the years, I have seen that card come up for me, every time, well, not every time, but many times when I'm literally signing a book contract or doing something like that. So I think there's something to be said for opening yourself up to the way the world is going to express itself to you through the cards, as well as the way you superimpose the world onto your cards.
Well, that relates back to Joe Liszewski's idea of the subjective synthesis that every magician has to eventually develop, where you practice an art, and you should at least begin in a traditional way, so you understand. It's sort of like if you're an artist, like you're a classically trained musician, you understand this. Mm-hmm. You obviously are also a natural musician. You're with that pitch thing you have. I mean, that's incredible. But your classical training enabled you to reach even further, attain greater heights with your natural gifts.
Tell my teacher that.
But there's a subjective synthesis where then we start in the process of meaning building with the mind. We begin to develop our own subjective lexicon of personal meanings for cards, symbols, yes, things like that. For me, those meanings are more like growths out of or inner dimensions of the set meanings. For instance, if we look at like an Omicron, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. In the Pythagorean letter mysticism, because you were talking about Kabbalah, and really a lot of you're gonna have to cut out like 4 knows there. I hate that so much, but yeah, no problem. I'll say it a few more times. Anyway, though, with Kabbalah, we have Tamura, we have Natarikon, and all of these techniques really originate in Pythagorean letter and number mysticism, that preceded it and became integrated into the Hebrew mysticism in Alexandria with the translation of the Septuagint. What I'm getting at here is the reason that was possible is because both languages, you have letters that are both letters and numbers, and in addition to that, those letters also have names, which probably goes back to hieroglyphic script of the Egyptians. So there's a polyvalency to each letter. You have an ox goad. What is that? What is an ox goad? But there's many dimensions to that symbol itself. Then there's dimensions that come off of the phonetic aspect. The sound of the letter has several dimensions. Then you have the number of the letter, and the number itself has several dimensions. And then when you combine all several numbers, which are also letters, together to form a word, that word can have several associations and dimensions. So I think that even the importance of learning the set original, the sort of the core meaning, leads us to this sort of pluriform multivalency, where we're able to access an entire spectrum of meaning and nuance.
Well, yes, there's that idea that there's a genetic code that if you can learn it, the idea that the alphabet in whatever tradition you're talking about is the basis for the unfolding of creation, right? It's all held in there. And I think that is, that's certainly a very attractive idea, the idea that you can begin with the basics and then proceed from there. But also it ties into the idea that language itself is something special. And I know we're saying that as three devotees of Hermes, so maybe that's a little predictable, but I mean, there really is something special about language and the way that it forms reality, even as we're speaking. And I think that that's core both in divination and magic.
Well, that's logos. Didn't Philip K. Dick say, I think it was Philip K. Dick said, language is a virus? And it's funny because when you get into logos, I think there you're starting to really get into you're getting into the bones of divination itself. Because the logos, people think, word just means, the word or the creator, but really logos is this sort of implicit entelechy, the underlying pattern of everything. And it's not only static, but it's dynamic. It's the warp and woof, which in the Northern tradition is the web of weird. You have the vertical strands and the horizontal strands. You have time and space, and the intersecting nodes of Indra's net. Each one of these little jeweled nodes is a point of consciousness. And I tend to see every system of divination is also a linguistic system, and each one of the letters of that system, which is also a symbol, as a point of consciousness. So I want to ask you, because we have your book on the Decans here, which is wonderful. I love the anecdotal component to your writing. It really draws you in and makes you feel like you're right there with you. Like I feel like when I'm reading your writing, I feel like I'm sitting right next to you or participating with you in your day. And it almost bridges that line between fiction and nonfiction, because there's this narrative element to it that draws you in, and so it almost creates a mythic dimension, which I really appreciate. And you wrote an entire book about the Decans and your experience with it, and the Decans were understood originally to be actual spirits, right. And that lends to the point of, well, are the cards spirits?
Yes. I think that's a really wonderful way of looking at them. And I think that there's something to be said for viewing them as spirits, in the same way that there's something to be said for finding the anima in anything, right? When you go for a walk in the woods, you're far more likely to get something out of it if you start from the assumption that it's alive, right? So I think there's something to be said for looking for the aliveness in the cards, to the extent that allows you to engage with them as if they're persons and can have a conversation with you, because I think it is about conversation. I think that, one of the things I tell people, I use the model of language a great deal in tarot, because I believe that once you learn this language of tarot, once you can interpret the symbols and have a sort of vocabulary that you can use, what is language for? You can have conversations, you can have arguments, you can talk back, which is magic, right? You can do this work once you know how to speak the language. So yes. So I think in general, perhaps language is a function of spirit in that way.
And building on this idea of conversation and interaction, I want to touch on this tiny subject of fate, and how that and how that fits into all this, because I think there could be a trap for diviners or people who are hobbyists or who play around with divination, that they could become trapped in fate. And my opinion is that the role of the magician or someone who is enlightened, perhaps, is to kind of break out of that maybe cycle of fate, or allows them flexibility in order to maneuver within that structure rather than being confined by it. What do you guys think?
Oh yeah, totally. I think about this a lot. I wrote there's a whole thing in Tarot Correspondences in the introduction about divination versus magic. I really do think that these questions of, I used to ask everyone I went on, this would drive interviewers crazy. I would ask everyone where they were on the scale of 1 to 10, fate versus free will.
Oh, nice.
And Gordon White got really peeved at me for that and had like a 10-minute discussion of what fate versus free will even means. So, diviners tend to be often to be very much on the side of fate, and magicians very much on the side of free will, or if you want to say determinism versus agency, if that's makes people feel a little less allergic. But I tend to think that I don't think that everything is fated, and I don't think everything is negotiable. I really don't. I think, at least from our perspective. So what I tend to say, and this is probably even more infuriating, is that I think it's constructive to use your illusion of free will to deal with your illusion of fate, if that makes sense. The idea that there is some modicum of agency may be an illusion, but so is the idea that you have no choice in the matter. So, I think you can work with those two intention to achieve what you desire. And there's also the fact that, one of the tenets of divination that I really subscribe to is that divination doesn't give you the specific thing, except for when it does. It gives you the quality of the moment, right? So the quality of the moment is that flex, that oracular drift, that archetypal flex that says that, the tower could mean something absolutely terrible happening, like a car crash, or it could mean you dropped your glass of milk on the floor, right? It could mean any number of different things. So I really believe that one of the things I do magically with my divination tools is I argue back and say, look, I would much prefer that we manifest in this way rather than that. So, I actually do quite a bit of sympathetic magic with my cards in that way, just to fulfill the archetypal need of that spirit to express itself while not completely fucking up my life.
Interesting.
Well, that actually, you said a few things that I would have said, actually, that I was going to answer. I'm on the same page with you about that. See, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the point that divination is more typically, historically, and in the rest of the world associated with spiritual traditions and religious traditions, magical traditions that are established and usually practiced by a priest of some kind, often a specialized priest Like in Egypt, there were actually specific diviner priests, and you still have that in Africa and so on and so forth. But it's a diagnostic tool, right? So, if you were taught magic correctly, or if you were fortunate enough to pick things up, on your own correctly or from the spirits, you should have learned, and I don't mean you specifically, I mean anybody, you should have learned that before you do any act of magic, you're supposed to divine beforehand to see, number one, if it's going to be effective, number two, if there could be deleterious effects from it, or number three, if you're just going to be wasting your time and nothing will happen. And the divination enables you to see the potentials of any action. And then if it's less than desirable, you can then use the divination to analyze and prescribe remedial actions. The divination can actually enable you to see how to change things so that the time stream aligns more with the outcome you would prefer to see. You can turn divination, like you said, active into a form of sympathetic magic. I mean, even if we look at the point that these cards, like think of the Waite Smith deck, right? I mean, how many people are using that deck at any given moment, right? Like on every day, any day that we pass through right now, there are thousands of people using that deck every minute of the day because of how widespread it is. There's so many bootlegs. It's been translated into so many languages. The images are ubiquitous. They're now public domain. So think of the amount of focused psychic energy being poured into every image of that deck at every moment of the day. That would animate it. It's animated naturally by that psychic energy. And so, yes, you can use the tarot as an active magical instrument to influence fate. And I love that you brought that up because that's something that's somewhere I was going to go. And I also want to touch on, a lot of what you're saying, a lot of the things that you're mentioning really originate in an animist worldview, an animistic attitude. And that is a primordial, I believe, really very human, original human attitude is this animism. And that's, and it goes hand in hand with panpsychism, the idea that all is mind.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think basically what we can do with cards is very similar to, what we can do with dreams in a sense. The practice, I think it's a practice, an Aboriginal practice in New Zealand where you come back from the dream and then you turn that dream into reality by making a song, or a piece of created work. And I often will end a reading with people by saying, look, you got this card, you got the Seven of Wands. Okay. I told you what I thought it means, but what I'd like you to do is print it out on a piece of paper, carry it around in your wallet, write a spell on it. What is it you want it to do? Because it's a way of reclaiming that language and saying, this is mine.
That reminds me of a funny story. I don't even know where I heard it. It might have been a Babylonian king, but during this divination, the diviner said that this king was going to die. And so they're like, okay, well, I'm going to step down as king. Here's this other guy. He's now the king. We kill him. Okay, he died. The king died. And now I'm back and we're all good. So,
right.
So, yeah, I mean, just that interaction with fate and with the world around you with the cards, like you guys are saying, makes a lot of sense.
Yes. I mean, there's definitely something to be said for just entering into conversation with fate. That is what I'm in it for. I don't know about everybody else, although it does mean that I periodically, on days I get the tower, end up crawling down the stairs head first, chewing pepper, and I really don't recommend people do that.
So in Japan, there's this idea, there's these spirits yokai, which. Yes. There's all kinds of yokai. They're really cool. There's also some great yokai movies, but I'm not even going to go there right now.
Yes, I make a yokai face mask with the yokai Amabie on it, who is that plague warden spirit thing.
That's so awesome. I got to see that. I want to see that. So the idea though is like if you have, if a house has a broom for like 100 years and it's passed down for a couple generations, that broom eventually is going to acquire a certain kind of sentience and become alive. I have found as I grew up going to flea markets, antique stores, yard sales. And when I was small, you would still come across some pretty remarkable antiques. So I developed a real love of that as a kid, running my hands over very old things, holding something a couple of 100 years old in my hands. And by the time I was an adult, I started to develop this awareness that older things do have a kind of spirit. We've all been to old locations, old places where the spirit of place is much stronger. And I think that idea that something comes alive after being present in this dimension for enough time, I think that applies to the cards too. I think that's something that we can say with the tarot. To me, it's almost an organism. It's so when I refer to it as a family tree, or when I refer to the cards as spirits, I'm not just using a metaphor, but I am saying I think this is almost like, at this point, on a psychic level, in a way, a living organism.
Yes,
maybe made of information.
Yes. Did you guys read his Dark Materials trilogy, Philip Pullman's?
No.
Oh, okay. So
No.
There's this idea. Well, it's a very interesting series, but there's an idea he has in there of the concept of dust with a capital D, which is sort of the accumulated experience, knowledge, memories, feelings, intentions. The information that goes into objects as well as into human beings, and that there's this idea that dust starts to accumulate around puberty, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I think my feeling is that cards are thick with dust, in the same way that the antiques you're talking about are.
Yeah, there really is that dimension to it. Oh, also another thing I wanted to mention was, you're talking about conversation, and it brings up another hermetic characteristic, that of negotiation. Because when I hear you saying when I hear you talking about conversation, what I hear you describing sometimes is negotiation.
Yes.
Like the kind of negotiation a lawyer or a diplomat or an interpreter does, or a translator. And I think that's all important, because all of those hermetic dimensions are dimensions of the same idea: translation, negotiation, interpretation, communication, all different sides. And these are all part of the divinatory art.
Bargaining as well. There's
bargaining.
that epithet cerdempore, which means like the person who governs the markets. Yeah, absolutely.
So there is this book called 36 Secrets. And I'm going to echo what Janet said earlier about your writing style. It's really enjoyable to read.
Thank you so much.
You have a very kind of poetic flair about you, just generally in all your writing, that I really enjoy, in your portrayal of how you walk through life. Just viewing these symbols and integrating them into your practice. I love it. And this book is a perfect example of everything we've been talking about today, actually, of this communication, this integration. And the Decan Walk seems like a great way for someone to enter into this conversation with the cards, with the Anima Mundi, with the stars. So can you maybe break down what the Decan journey is?
Yes. So I think, as I understood it when I first heard of it from Austin Coppock and Gordon White, it was a way of walking through the entire year, 10 days at a time, decan by decan, and ritualizing it in a sense, which I thought sounded great. And here is my sort of magical imposter syndrome popping up again. I did not actually sit down and, on Aries 1 and get myself a bunch of iron and red stuff and do an invocation of Aries or anything like that. Mm-hmm. All I did was I thought about it and wrote about it over the course of 10 days. And, to me, that was incredibly meaningful. I would encourage anyone, whether or not you do the ritual piece of it, and I think it's great if you do, to come out of each 10 days of your Decan walk with something you made, something you created, something that's unique to you. Because I think that, art is the perfume of mortality. And I think that, as practitioners, it's what we get. That's the reward. That's the way we build meaning into our lives. So to me, that's the I've seen a lot of people picking up 36 Secrets to do their own Decan walks, and that makes me incredibly happy. There are people who are like hacking the book and making notes in it and putting artistic things into it and putting more charts into it, which is amazing. And that really to see people making it their own is wonderful for me, because I wrote in the introduction that it's essentially a set of tools. I said, this book is my compass, my knife, and my camp stove. And I invite you to make use of it in any way you see fit. And I really mean that. I really mean that, because for me, it's just navigational work, this book. And if anybody can use it to find their way on their own journey, then that makes me happy.
So can we step back a minute, and can you explain what a Decan is and how this all works?
Right. Yeah. So Decan is, so we all know the 12 zodiacal signs, which we should think of as being disposed around a 360-degree circle, dividing it into 12 sections of the sky, or 12 sections of time. Here, space and time converge. And a Decan is merely a 1/3 of each sign, 10 degrees of that 360-degree arc, or 10 degrees of the sky, if you want to think about it that way, roughly 10 days of the year. There are going to be a few Decans that are going to be 11 because we have a 365-day year. But the thing about Decans is therefore that with each sign you have 3 of them. So we're in Taurus right now, Taurus 1, Taurus 2, and Taurus 3. And the correlation to the cards is as follows. The Golden Dawn assigned the 36 Decans to the 36 numeric minors of the tarot. So that would be the 2 through 10 of the 4 suits. And it's pretty easy to remember in the sense that, if you assign elements to the 4 suits, wands are fire, cups are water, swords are air, pentacles are earth. There's some dispute over swords and wands, as always. Go figure. But air and fire. But if you follow the Golden Dawn system, which of course is the genetic code for the entire English school of tarot that most modern decks that are not Marseille decks are based on, then it's fair enough to say that those elemental correspondences hold. So therefore, you take your 2 through 10 minors of tarot, and the 2, 3, and 4 will be the cardinal signs. The 5, 6, and 7 will be the fixed signs, and the 8, 9, and 10 will be the mutable signs. And then each of those will be governed, each Decan will be governed by one of the 7 traditional planets. They go in order. Took me years to understand this, and, which is ridiculous because you can just look at a chart. This is why I make books with charts. So, but anyway, so that's the way it works. It's basically, you start with Aries 1, you end with Pisces 3, and you go through 36 Decans 10 days at a time.
Awesome. So it seems like you've thought about this. So can you... Can you give us an example for the Decan we're in right now?
Yes. So, for example, we're in my favorite Decan to talk about. In fact,
Perfect.
Oh no. So this is the Taurus 1, which is the 5 of Pentacles, and the 5 of Pentacles is, as a matter of fact, one of the mercurial Decans. There are 5 of those. In fact, because 7 times 5 equals 35, every planet gets 5 shots at a Decan, except for Mars, which gets 2. So there's 6 martial Decans. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The 5 of Pentacles is a mercurial Decan in the Chaldean system. There's other systems as well, but this is the one that applies for what we're talking about. And I absolutely love this Decan because it's the imagery for it is so gnarly. This is the 5 of Pentacles, right? Where we have the church with the people who are lame and crippled outside of the church in the snow, having a really, really hard time. And I love this Decan because over the years, it has taught me that there's a lot more going on than simply having a really bad day. Sometimes you look at this and it's sort of like that children's story, Alexander's horrible, terrible, awful, very bad day. But it's not just that, right? It's not just that. And that's the thing about tarot, learning to see the layers behind everything else that's going on. First of all, if you, and this is one of the things I talk about in the chapter, if you think about Mercury and you think about Taurus, those have correspondences within the major arcana. So we're talking about Mercury is the magician, as you both very well know, and Taurus is represented by the Hierophant. So you have the magician and the Hierophant. You have these two very different energies going on. The magician, of course, is Mercury, the thief, the lockpicker. The Hierophant is the keeper of the keys. So you put those two together and you're going to get some very interesting dynamics going on where somebody's trying to break into the house and somebody's trying to keep them out. Right. So, not naming names, but so those two together, really produce this fascinating interplay of, this negotiation between outside and inside, between curators and thieves, between, apostolic knowledge and the desire to seize knowledge for yourself. There's all sorts of things that's going on in there. And so the sort of overall theme I came up with to describe it is sacred doubt. It's this idea that you can't know everything, and yet there's that the negotiation that you undertake with the belief structure is in some way fundamental. So, so I have had this card for all manner of things, for being locked out of places, for sure, for things breaking down, for my 20-year-old son leaving the car with no gas in it, that kind of thing. But also for, the Decan commentators talked about this as a decan of geometry, of plowing and sowing, of germinating seeds, something like that. I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember the exact phrasing and from Picatrix, but, and that is a mercurial function, to look ahead and to worry about what might be coming and to do your best to anticipate and plan for it. So to me, that's part of it. There's the Hermetic title, which is the Lord of Worry, but it also brings in this idea that we worry about the things that we love, that we care about. And this is the double meaning of care, right? Because if we have cares, well, we have problems. But if we care about something, we love it. So to love things is to have problems. It's just fundamental to being human. Mm-hmm. So, so that's something I've really learned to work with. I also think that this card has something to do with ritual magic, because you take the magician and the Hierophant, you think about all of the preparations and the technical obsessiveness that goes into producing a ritual. That's part of this card as well. And sympathetic magic, in terms of sympathetic magic with this card, I have worked with it successfully in the past to kind of express its energy in ways that I choose. So, for example, the main iteration of this that I usually give is when I drew this card a couple years ago, probably a year and a half ago, and I was concerned because the lock on our front door was broken. It's not a door that anybody uses, but obviously you don't want to have a slide bolt that's broken on your door. And, I didn't want to bother my husband about fixing it because he was at work. And it had been just sort of, I'd been holding it closed with like a box for a long time. So I finally, having gotten the 5 of Pentacles, I went and I got his tools and I fixed the lock that day. And to me, that was very much in the nature of this card, to talk about, well, worrying constructively, thinking ahead, anticipating what might go wrong, but also working with the lock and the key and, leaving them in a state that was amenable to my own purposes.
Well said. Yeah, that's really, really intriguing. And it brought to mind a few things for me. Number one, the idea of need, right? So, need is fundamental to magical practice, really, and spiritual practice as well. And I don't think there's anything wrong with this, right? Like, most people pray when they need something. And I've seen people be critical of this, but the gods understand that mankind is in an environment that is not always favorable to them. And they established the science of prayer to ameliorate these misfortunes. So I think that need often takes the form of something that is requisite for completeness. And I think if you look at the pictorial narrative in the Waite-Smith deck of the coins or pentacles, the next card is actually a card of charity. Like these people then in the next card, in the Six of Coins, are receiving what they need. And so in a way, this card is a prefiguration of something positive. I've had this card come up when I was searching for some place to stay in a city when the initial place to stay had fallen through, something like that.
Absolutely.
And then it ends up being a better place anyway. So, and I love your point about the ritual magic part, because why are you doing this magic? Why are you doing this, either the ceremonial rite or the spell or whatever you're doing? You're doing it because there is something, whether on the level of material need or psychic need or spiritual need, and desire is a form of need, that is motivating you, impelling you through the unconscious to seek completeness.
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like, and even if, since for some reason, maybe it's because of the Mercury thing, for some reason the runes have crept in sneakily to this podcast, and it's weird because I rarely talk about runes on the podcast, so it's really weird. But there's a rune called need, and that rune is really useful to draw to you what you need when you're suffering through a situation of deprivation. It's like nature abhors a vacuum.
That makes a great deal of sense. And I just really love that idea that the magician, approaches the Hierophant and tries to work within the system in some way to get what is beneficial for himself.
Well, what about this too? I mean, you're describing the relationship from one approach, right? Mm-hmm. Where the magician approaches the Hierophant. And you could almost consider the magician the magician isn't green. He's not a neophyte. The magician is like an adept coming to the Hierophant, who's obviously like the master, and he's seeking that deeper knowledge that the Hierophant can give, or the deeper skill sets, or the initiation perhaps that will transform that magician perhaps into a Hierophant in their own right at some point. But if we look at it conversely, most of these human traditions, at least mythically, originate in a Promethean theft of fire, right, or esoteric knowledge and power from the gods that is passed to humankind and eventually calcinates and becomes a tradition, becomes a tradition that then becomes a manifestation of the very thing that was stolen from. Mm-hmm. And then eventually it comes to a point where, through the sort of Neoplatonic reversion, where there's a new thief that comes to steal, or even rightfully acquire and create a new tradition. Right.
I think there's something very interesting going on there, because Hierophant, of course, is the revealer of the sacred, right? That's what that word means. And there's something in there, in the Orphic hymns, there's all this kind of language around that term hieros, the sacred, often in the sort of contest of offering sacred words. And I often like to think about the idea that in sacrifice, we sacrifice things, we sacrifice, materia to the gods, but we also offer the sacrifice of language. And to me, this is an idea that has been really dogging me for months since starting that PGM class. And I don't know if you remember, Dom, but there was a class right in the beginning where Jack talked about offering the gods the praise, offering them. That is the offering, the words of praise, right? And to me, you bring together this mercurial figure who is nothing but words, and this Hierophant who is a broker of relationship with the gods, and each has something the other wants at some level.
Well, in the Hypnodia Cryptae, in the Hermetica, it speaks about the sacrifice of speech, mm-hmm, or the spoken sacrifice. In the Hermetic Federation, we have something like that. And the idea is that there is this noetic sacrifice for noetic gods. The sacrifice is the type of sacrifice is dependent upon the mode of reality that we're interacting with. So if we're approaching the material archons or the material gods, material sacrifices may be more appropriate. For the psychic or cosmic gods, a psychic sacrifice, but for a holy for the nous and for the hypercosmoi, it would be a noetic or a prayerful spoken sacrifice, because the gods essentially are self-originated and self-dependent. They don't need anything from human beings. So the expression of the spoken praise, the spoken sacrifice, is actually an acknowledgement of the presence of the God within the adherent. It's actually the God within the human speaking back to the God within the heavens.
Yes, it's offering the creations of the created.
Yeah, I think it's the Poimandres. In the Poimandres prayer, it said, "Accept this pure offering of speech from a soul and a heart which rises to you."
Yes, that's right. That's right. And I also wanted to mention, another thing that your analogy with the 5 brought to mind is, magician really comes from magos in Greek, but that's just the Greek rendering of the name for a Zoroastrian priest. So the name magician actually originates in the name for a hierophant or priest of the Zoroastrian religion, and that's especially significant because that religion is really the root of Christianity, and it was a profound influence on Judaism and Christianity, and of course Islam as well because of its proximity. And then additionally, Zoroastrianism was a profound influence on Buddhism. Shingon Buddhism actually acknowledges this, and so we have this. It's interesting. The word for magician actually originates in the word for priest of one of the world's oldest religions.
Oh, no kidding. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and fire. It's a religion of fire. It's a religion of light. So again, there's this. I mentioned this in a recent podcast. There's a Christian term used more by the Orthodox, but originally it was more universally used, homoousios, of one essence. And I think when we're looking at the fool, the magician, the hierophant, the hermit, we're dealing with different modes of one being or one state. The hermit is like the forest monk or the desert anchorite, and then you have the hierophant within the established tradition, and then you have the magician, the vagabond. But for instance, in Egypt, most of the priests would be in the temple for half the year, and then they would be, many of them would be doing magical work like we see in the PGM for local communities for the other portion of the year for their keep. So in that example, you quite literally have somebody on one hand in the temple practice, and then on the other side of the year, which relates to the Decans, acting in this sort of shamanic magical capacity.
That's fascinating. Absolutely.
All right, guys. Well, we're running up on about 2 hours, so I think
sorry about that.
No, man. I
think it was a great conversation, though.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was fantastic.
Super fun. You're really easy to talk to, Susie. So, in staying with the form of podcasts, let's end it how we should. So, where can people find what you're doing, Susie? And you've got a lot going on, like you mentioned at the beginning, but let's kind of summarize.
Yes. So I guess the primary place to find me is www.tsusanchang.com. And then people can also, of course, find the Fortune's Wheelhouse podcast anywhere they're listening to podcasts, including wherever they're listening to this podcast right now. Just look up Fortune's Wheelhouse. Then I also have my Etsy store where you can buy merch if you're so inclined. It's www.etsy.com/shop/tarotista. And I think we'll leave it there. There's other places, but actually social media, right? So social media on Instagram and Twitter, I'm T. Susan Chang. Generally on Facebook, I encourage people to reach out to me at the Fortune's Wheelhouse Academy group, which is a officially unofficial fan group, but it's got like 1,000 members, and I post there every day. So that's usually where I am.
My mind is boggled by how much you juggle. I don't like. You do a lot.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it was great. We loved having you on, and we would love to have you on again in the future.
That would be great. Thanks, guys.
That was a fun one. It really was. We really enjoyed this delightful guest, and boy, what an eloquent, effusive, intelligent speaker. I really felt like in awe of her intellect.
Yeah, she's super fun. I mean, if you get a chance to listen to her on any of her other million appearances and other podcasts and her own podcast, just a fun, super knowledgeable lady. I mean, she knows her stuff when it comes to tarot. She eats it, she breathes it, and it shows. You put in the work, you reap the rewards.
Absolutely. You could see the influence of Hermes on her mind, and the way that the radiations of his pneuma caused the mind to develop and grow and become more than what it was prior to his appearance in the person's life. It's clearly evident with her. In other words, she's gangster. So, I'm really glad she came on. I had such a wonderful time. It was truly great. And I think that our listeners, there's the Hermetic thing again. It's all sort of a synesthetic paradigm. Anyway, our listeners should pay attention. If you notice, we have this invocation in the beginning of this episode, and then what happened was a conversation that took on a life of its own, that was sort of animated and I would say directed by the Hermetic pneuma. And this is something to contemplate when you engage with Hermes or Mercurius or any of his other manifestations sincerely. If the god chooses to, he may bless you, per his prerogative, with intellective effluences that embrace your consciousness and guide it in amazing, interesting, poetic, profound ways.
On that point, let's move into the book review. I think you've got a good one this week. What is it? What do you got?
Yeah, this book is really neat. It's called Hunting Wisdom, a Bacchic Orphic Diviner's Manual. This is written by a Dionysian diviner and obviously devotee, H. Jeremiah Lewis. He serves his community under the name Sanion, and it is essentially Greek Reconstructionist work, and he calls it, or they call it, the Starry Bull tradition. This book lays a foundation and protocols for ancient Greek inspired divination, but it is not slavish to ancient sources. Rather, it also builds upon them in a Dionysian context with new work you can do. I'll give you some examples of some of the topics touched upon within this. It gives you first, there is preparations, so it helps you understand how to prepare for divination, including ideas of purity, spiritual discernment, an offering rite, cleansing and consecration. And then this little oracle book, the Oracle Book of Sanion, the Orpheo Telest, touches on things such as the Oracle of the Coins, the Starry Bull Alphabet Oracle, how to make your very own bibliomantic system. There's cloth divining in here. There is a grape leaf oracle. There's a prognostic for thunder by the hours of the day. Pyromancy is involved here. Phallomantia, personal favorite. Oracle of Phanes, another one I love. Even using toys as divination tools. The appendix contains miscellaneous sources on Bacchic Orphic purity regulations, a little bit about the author. This book is a substantial book too. It weighs in at 270 pages. This author has written many other interesting works that I recommend people check out. His entire His entire aim primarily seems to be Bacchic Orphism, and his emphasis, probably due to his daimon, is upon the god Dionysus. Some other books that he's written are Spirits of Initiation, which is about the initiation of Dionysos from the satyr's mouth. A book on Greco-Egyptian polytheism called The Balance of Two Lands, The Heart of the Labyrinth, Echoes of Alexandria, and more. I was very impressed with this work. It is made to be used, so it is a practical book, and I, at this point in my life, favor practicality over intellectuality. However, there is plenty of pithy intellectual contemplation of inspirations garnered from ancient sources in it as well. I mean, if you're into divination, I recommend this if the Hellenic mysteries hold interest for you. It's just an intriguing, wonderful, useful little tome.
And the name and author?
Hunting Wisdom, a Bacchic Orphic Diviner's Manual by H. Jeremiah Lewis.
Awesome. That really actually sounds super interesting.
Yeah, I know you. You're just going to end up buying it.
Probably. Okay, well, thank you for doing that.
Big thanks to our supporters. We love you. Big thanks to our listeners. We love you wherever you are, whether in Eastern Europe or Korea or USA or UK or Africa or anywhere else. We love you. We're grateful for you. You know that this is a labor of love done in service of the divine, and we don't have ulterior motives.
Okay, nicely said. You can keep up with this on Facebook, of course, YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, etc. So anywhere you find podcasts, you can find us. And again, thank you very much. We appreciate you. And we will see you in the next episode.
Yeah, see you guys next time. Keep your feet on the ground, stay humble, seek the divine, seek the mysteries.
Boom.